Welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're here. Before we get started, let me just say this. The story we're about to dive into isn't just about music. It's about small-town life, family, dreams, struggles, and how the roots of where you come from can shape the person you eventually become. Today we're stepping into the childhood of Morgan Wallen, one of the biggest stars in country music right now, but before the awards, the sold-out arenas, and the streaming records, there was just a little boy growing up in a tiny town called Sneedville, Tennessee. And trust me, once you understand where he came from, you'll see his music in a whole new light. Now, picture this: rolling hills, winding back roads, churches that ring their bells on Sunday morning, and a town where everybody knows everybody. That's Sneedville. It's not the kind of place where you'd expect a global music star to be born, but sometimes the most unlikely places create the strongest stories. Can you imagine growing up in a town so small that your classmates also end up being your neighbors, your teammates, and even the kids you sit beside in church? That's the kind of community Morgan was surrounded by as a kid. Morgan Cole Wallen was born on May 13, 1993. His father, Tommy, was a preacher, and his mother, Leslie, was a teacher. Faith and family were the pillars of his childhood, and those values shaped him from the very start. If you've ever listened closely to his songs, you'll notice those roots: songs about home, about mistakes and redemption, about family and faith. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came from this little boy who grew up with both discipline and love in a home that revolved around church, community, and music. From a young age, Morgan was introduced to singing in church. Can you picture that little boy, standing shyly but proudly in front of the congregation, his voice carrying through the pews? That was one of his very first stages, and though it wasn't a concert arena, it planted something deep inside him. Music was never just background noise for him. It was a way to connect, a way to express, a way to belong. But Morgan wasn't just a kid who sang. He was also a kid who loved sports, especially baseball. For a while, baseball was actually his first big dream. He was good at it too, talented enough that for years he thought that would be his future. Imagine young Morgan practicing on dusty fields, throwing pitches, dreaming of one day making it to the big leagues. Have you ever had a childhood dream that felt so real, you could almost touch it? His life in Sneedville wasn't about glamour. It was about long summer days, Friday night lights, tight-knit friendships, and a kind of simplicity that most of us long for but rarely get to experience. Morgan himself has often said that growing up in such a small town gave him both a sense of grounding and a hunger for something more. It's funny, isn't it? Small towns can give you comfort and security, but they can also spark that restlessness to chase bigger horizons. When you think about childhood, some of the most vivid memories often come from school. For Morgan, school wasn't just about textbooks and homework. It was where he started shaping the pieces of who he was. In Sneedville, the classrooms weren't packed like in big cities. Instead, it was the kind of place where teachers knew every kid by name, and parents often knew each other outside the classroom. There was a closeness in that environment, but also a pressure because in a small town, everybody notices what you do, and everybody talks. Can you imagine what it's like to grow up with that kind of spotlight, even before you ever step on a stage? From the start, Morgan's parents were very supportive of his interests. His dad being a pastor meant that church was more than just a Sunday routine. It was woven into everyday life. His mom, as a teacher, made sure he understood discipline and the importance of staying focused. That combination of faith and structure built a foundation that would serve him later, even when he didn't realize it at the time. Have you ever noticed how the lessons your parents taught you as a kid sometimes come back to guide you years later, even when you thought you'd forgotten them? At school, Morgan had two big things that made him stand out: his talent for sports and his natural connection with music. Let's start with baseball, because for years that was his world. He wasn't just another kid on the field. He was a pitcher, and not just any pitcher. He was good enough that people around him thought baseball might be his ticket to the future. Picture Morgan on a warm spring evening, standing on that dusty mound, gripping the baseball tightly, eyes locked on the catcher's glove. The crowd, made up of neighbors and family, watches in silence before he throws a fastball that cuts through the air. That was his stage long before he found himself on a music stage. But then there was music. At home, Morgan was surrounded by it. His parents loved different genres, and his exposure wasn't just limited to country. Rock, gospel, even a little bit of pop slipped into his world. His dad encouraged him to sing at church, and he picked up the violin and piano when he was still young. Imagine him, small hands struggling at first to find the right notes, but gradually learning how to make music flow. It wasn't just a hobby. It became a way for him to feel something deeper, even as a kid. The thing is, music and sports don't always mix easily. Baseball practices and games demanded discipline, but so did learning music. Morgan had to juggle both, and for a while it looked like baseball was going to win. Teachers and coaches saw his athletic potential, and his parents encouraged him to keep following that dream. But every once in a while, music would sneak in and remind him of its power, like when he sang at church or when he sat alone in his room, strumming out melodies. Growing up in Sneedville, there weren't endless opportunities waiting around every corner. If you wanted something big, you had to make it happen yourself. But what that town gave Morgan was a strong sense of community. His friends were like family and people showed up for each other. Have you ever felt that closeness, where your neighbors are more than neighbors? They're people you share your life with? That small-town childhood, where baseball fields and church choirs shaped his early years, was building two paths for Morgan. One looked like a future in sports. The other looked like a future in music. And for a long time, even he didn't know which road he was going to take. What about you? When you were growing up, did you have two passions pulling you in different directions, making you wonder which one would eventually define you? As Morgan grew older, the balance between sports and music started to shift. Baseball was no longer just a hobby. It was his dream, his focus, the thing he thought could carry him out of Sneedville into something bigger. High school became the place where that dream really took root. Coaches noticed his talent, teammates respected him, and his reputation as a pitcher was growing. Imagine a teenager standing tall on the pitcher's mound, the crowd buzzing, his fastball cutting through the air with precision. Morgan wasn't just playing the game, he was living it. And here's something important. Baseball wasn't just about the sport for him. It was about discipline, teamwork, learning to push yourself, and the thrill of competition. He loved the idea of carrying his town's pride on his shoulders. In small towns like Sneedville, sports teams are more than just games. They're community gatherings, nights when everyone shows up to cheer, where the whole town's spirit seems to rest on the outcome. And there was Morgan, right in the middle of it, feeling that energy every time he played. At this point, music was more in the background. Sure, he still sang at church, he still dabbled with instruments, but if you had asked him back then what he wanted to do with his life, the answer would have been baseball. His parents supported him, his coaches believed in him, and he had his eyes set on making it to college ball and maybe even further. Do you remember being a teenager and having that one dream you thought would define your entire future? But life has a way of throwing curveballs, sometimes literally. For Morgan, that curveball came in the form of an injury. During his teenage years, just as baseball was becoming more serious, he hurt his elbow. It wasn't just a minor setback. It was the kind of injury that changed everything. Suddenly, the future he had envisioned, the dream he had worked so hard for, was slipping away. Imagine the heartbreak of realizing that something you've given your all to might no longer be possible. Have you ever had a moment like that, where everything you thought you were working toward seemed to vanish overnight? That injury forced Morgan to step back and ask himself who he was without baseball. For a young man whose identity had been tied to the sport, that wasn't easy. But sometimes when one door closes, another quietly opens, even if you don't notice it right away. For Morgan, that open door was music. With baseball no longer an option, he turned to something that had always been there in the background, his voice. It was during this time that music began to move from being a side passion to a lifeline. He started picking up the guitar more seriously, experimenting with songwriting, and pouring his emotions into lyrics. Think about it. Here was a teenager who had just lost one dream, finding comfort and healing in another. Music gave him something baseball couldn't at that moment. It gave him a way to express the pain, the loss, but also the hope. And that's the beauty of Morgan's story. If his baseball dream hadn't been cut short, who knows if he ever would have chased music as fiercely as he did. Sometimes our greatest disappointments are the very things that redirect us to our true calling. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join this channel for more amazing stories like this. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts.